So welcome, and in this section we're going to be looking at American cultural and social diversity, and this is going to be section 3 of chapter, it should say chapter 31 here, not chapter 30, so we are looking at chapter 31, and much of the allure of the Americas derive from the spaces and diverse population. So the Americas are very large, two continents, right? And lots of, diverse geography, landscapes, economies, products, climates, everything, but also a lot of different ethnic groups, social classes, different social structures. So there's a lot of diversity there. It's hard to pinpoint and say there's one thing that is characteristic of the Americas because it's so diverse. And so in the United States, we saw the emergence of a multicultural society. In fact, it still is. United States is the most multicultural society in the world. Okay, it is a very unique country in that sense, and it dates back to this period. By the late 19th century, it was very multicultural. It had, including the indigenous people that were here, then the European American settlers who came from different parts of Europe, African Americans who had come as slaves and now were some of the laborers now, and then the growing number of migrants from different parts of Europe and Asia. And as the population grew, you started to see the native people being pushed more and more onto reservations as land settlers continue to push west. So the population of the United States kept growing and growing and growing. And eventually the United States, remember when with the Trail of Tears, and they established Oklahoma as Indian territory, they promised the people of the Native Americans that was going to be their land. But as soon as there came a need for more land, they continued to break treaties. And so Native American scholars today call it the Trail of Broken Treaties because the United States government has signed hundreds of treaties with Native American people over the last 200 plus years, and it has broken almost every single one of them. Every time it needed something, a mineral, a resource, they wanted to build a base, they would remove people from land and put them onto reservations. And if you've ever been to, like, if you want to think of like reservations here in San Diego, we have a lot of reservations here out in San Diego, out near Jamul, near Campo. But today, Native American reservations here in California and San Diego are known for their casinos. So if you think of where the casinos, Barona, Sycuan, Viejas, right? Where are they? They're not by the beach. They're not downtown. They're not in Bishop Village. They're out in the remote areas that are hot, that are desert, and that's where they had to live. So Native American people are marginalized, and they're cramped on marginalized territories. They're place where nobody else wanting to live, and because they didn't have the weaponry to fight back, they begrudgingly left, even in those meager lands, and they lived on their own reservations. Okay? And the United States continued to embark on a policy in the 19th century to try to reduce Native autonomy. It had eventually promised them, reservations were supposed to be like their own countries. But again, the United States, using the Bureau of Indian Affairs, has constantly moved to take away their rights. There are a few Native American reservations today, like the Oneida, I think it's the Oneida people out in New York. They have their own passport, and they can travel the world with their own passport. But not many have that strength. Most Native Americans became dependent. So the laws were aimed to reduce Native Americans. They used Americanization schools. In your textbook, there's a picture of an Americanization school where Native American children, they were removed from their families on the reservations, and they were sent, 2, 3, 4 states away to boarding schools where they would cut their hair, they would change their name, they would punish them for speaking their Native American language, and they pretty much made them ashamed to be Indian. So by the time these children went back with their families, they didn't want anything to do with their families. They were ashamed of their families. Their families felt like their culture was being ripped from them. And so other Native Americans were sent on traveling shows, like they were paraded kind of like entertainment in vaudeville shows. There was shows like Buffalo Bill and Wild West shows. They traveled the world. So some scholars refer to this as the American Holocaust, because after the initial conquest and killing of natives, even after the U.S. was established and laws were established, it continued to use laws to try to erase Native American cultures and try to eliminate them, try to change their culture by taking the children and trying to quote unquote Americanize them. In 1887, the Dawes Severalty Act shifted land policies away from collective tribal reservations and toward individual tracts of land that were meant to promote family farms that were once common in white U.S. society. Now it became less competitive. So even laws made it harder for Native American people to become autonomous. So all of these, they did have some Native resistance, but again, the Native resistance was, some kids fled from boarding schools. It wasn't like an armed resistance. Sometimes they refused some of the land policies, but Native American control began to diminish. And over the following decades, tribes have tried to rebuild their Native identities. So even today, there's a very small percentage of Native American people left, but they still resist by maintaining their identities. Also making up part of the multicultural society had been now the freed slaves. The Civil War ended slavery, but it didn't bring about instant equality for freed slaves and then their African American descendants. So trying to establish a place for free slaves, American society and Northern Force armies that were sent to occupy the South, and they forced them to try to undergo a program of reconstruction. What they were trying to do is they were trying to create a society that would incorporate the freed slaves into the economy. They extended the civil rights to freed slaves. They provided black men with voting rights. Black and white citizens in southern states elected biracial governments for the first time in U.S. history. Freed slaves participated actively in public affairs. Right? There were in the era of Reconstruction, there were more African Americans in government back in the 1800s than there are today in 2021. Okay, so, but Reconstruction ends, there's a violent backlash in the South. And this is what gives rise to the KKK, right? And to Jim Crow laws. So there's after Reconstruction ends, okay, the U.S. Army that occupied the South, they retreat. They now begin to create new laws, pass new laws that begin to make it hard for African Americans to vote. And this ushers in what are called the Jim Crow eras. You started having segregated schools, segregated towns, some towns where you were not allowed to be and you had to leave the town by the time the sun went down if you were there to work. So these Jim Crow laws basically made African Americans second-class citizens, gave them inferior education, passed things like poll taxes where you had to pay in order to vote because they knew a lot of African Americans couldn't afford to pay to vote, and that was a way to keep them from voting. The KKK terrorized and lynched people. People were accused of crimes they didn't commit. They were scapegoated. So it was very ugly after this. So just because slavery ended didn't mean the problems went away. And that's why we still have issues of racism today, because we've never really spoken the truth about what happened after the end of slavery to continue to treat African Americans as second-class citizens. So segregated society grows, and little by little, the African American participation in government begins to disappear in a lot of states in the South, in places like Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and other southern states. Okay, other African slaves became sharecroppers. People were supposed to have been given land. They were supposed to, I believe, be given like 40 acres and a mule to begin to work, but that promise never came about. Okay, so a lot of them worked doing the same type of labor they used to do, right? But but they were now doing it for their former slave owners. So they were still kind of working the lands they had worked for their former slave owners, but now they were getting paid very little or allowed to live on the land. But that didn't give them the equal rights. We also see changes in the role of women, the Industrial Revolution and participation more in the workplace and in unions start to give women more political clout and more political power, especially women that were being educated. In 1848, they have the Seneca Falls Convention, and this is the first large-scale convention to push for women's suffrage, women's right to vote. So during this period, women are disenfranchised. So you will see that word, the franchise, and that means the right to vote. So disenfranchised means you are not allowed to vote. So feminists at the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848 issued the Declaration of Sentiments that was modeled after the Declaration of Independence, right? They say we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. And they demanded equal political and economic rights for U.S. women. So throughout the 19th century, there's going to be women are fighting for new opportunities in education, in employment, and all of this was to offer alternatives to the life of marriage and domesticity that was being pushed. So you had women's colleges that were formed, and a lot of women chose career over marriages for some. And there were times where in some societies that was seen, women were sometimes considered crazy. They needed to see a psychologist or a therapist because they didn't want to get married. And some people just couldn't imagine, how dare a woman not want to be married and have children? Like, who doesn't want to squeeze a human life out of themselves, right? Like if there was something wrong with the woman for wanting a career. So in some societies, it was treated as this whole, like, what's wrong with you? What do you mean you want to be independent? Aren't you happy being dependent on a man? So that was the mentality. And so these women were fighting to change that concept. So it is important to note, though, that women still do not have the right to vote in the 19th century. It isn't until after World War I that that's going to happen. And then the rest of the multicultural population comes from the migrant population. From 1840 to 1914, 25 million Europeans migrate to the United States from different parts of Europe, bringing new foods, music, dances, holidays, sports, languages. You see hostility born from Native Americans. So nativism has always been something, right? When the Germans came, they faced discrimination. When the Italians came, when the Irish came, anyone who came would often face hostility from the native-born English-speaking population. You see this poster here from the Chinese Exclusion Act. And so out of this, because of this discrimination that people face, because of the hostility, immigrants would often find themselves banding together to support themselves. Businesses that would support each other, that would have food from their native countries, where they can help each other with resources. You had like the Five Points in New York was a very big Irish neighborhood. So was part of Boston, Massachusetts. You can see the legacy today in the basketball team, the Boston Celtics. Little Italy in New York. There's also Little Italy in Chicago. There's one here in San Diego. There's a Chinatown in New York. There's a Chinatown in San Francisco. Like I mentioned earlier, Vancouver. There are places in San Jose, California. There's Japantown. In Los Angeles, there's Koreatown, right? So these are called ethnic enclaves. And then part of that native racist kind of attitude led to the passing of laws prohibiting immigrants from China in 1882 and Japan in 1908. So these were discriminatory policies that were passed where the United States preferred to have immigrants that looked more like other Americans. They favored European immigration over the immigration from China, from Japan, also from Mexico, although Mexican immigration was valued for its cheap labor in places like California. Canada also sees some cultural contrasts. So French and British settlers had dominated Canada. Indigenous people, like elsewhere, had been misplaced. They were a minority you also had escaped slaves. So Canada was free. So a lot of people that escaped slavery fled to Canada where they could be free, but they weren't equal. Blacks were still segregated and they were still disenfranchised. When British Columbia experienced a gold rush, it lures Chinese immigrants. Between 1896 and 1914, there are 3 million immigrants to Canada from the United States, from Britain, and from Eastern Europe. And so Canada's population, still largely descended from British and French settlers. And as they expanded west, they also came in contact with Native Americans. There was also mixing with Native Americans, right? Just like what you had in Mexico, the mestizos. In Canada, they were called the métis. And this is where European settlers often married with Native women. So they gave rise to the métis, which was this mixed population. A major outbreak in, problems between society takes place in the 1870s and 1880s, when Native people and the Métis had moved west throughout the 19th century to try to preserve land and trading rights, but they drove the British Canadians west, right? Or the drive of British Canadians west begins to threaten them. So you have a conflict between the British Canadians and the Métis. And Louis Riel is one of the people who leads this resistance, and he's eventually executed. And that reasserts the British Canadian power. So even though, you have French and British Canadians, this kind of showed that it's going to be the British Canadians that are going to have a little bit more power than the French Canadians or the Métis. And then in Latin America, we continue to see the mestizo, the mixed population that had already been present. That's going to continue. So that's the colonial legacy, right? The social hierarchy that we'd seen before with the criollos on top and the mestizos, the zambos, the mulattos, the castizos in the middle. Indigenous people, freed slaves, and their descendants were at the bottom, and they had very limited opportunities. So they continued. Even today, the indigenous people in Mexico continued to be marginalized as they are in other countries, especially places like Argentina, in Chile. So color and gender become a factor in social hierarchy, in position. And then we begin to see more diversity in the 19th century with Asian and Indian immigrants arriving. In South America, you had people that were coming from India, settling some of the places like Guyana, and Japanese immigrants going into Peru and into Mexico. A lot of Europeans went to Argentina. They called it the Paris of the Americas. Argentinians are very European, in their culture, ethnically, they're very European. A lot of Argentinians descend from Italians. And so that's the identity that they've developed. There's also a group of they call Argentine cowboys in the Pampas, the gauchos. So they develop an ethnic egalitarian society because in the Pampas it became more of the pastoral style. So no matter what color you were, it was a little bit more equal. So there wasn't as much discrimination because their lifestyle revolved more around the culture of horsemanship and the gaucho lifestyle, the herding of animals. So this was a very distinct culture from the indigenous people and from the urban dwellers, the city people, right, that were much more like the Europeans. But the gauchos were independent and self-sufficient, but the caudillos would come along and kind of force them to play by the rules of the caudillos. And then Latin America remained very patriarchal and very male-dominated. We call this machismo. Okay, so this idea, this machismo is a central characteristic in Latin America, right? Women were disenfranchised. Women could not manage estates without permission from a man. They received rough treatment. It was acceptable to hit women. In a lot of places, this practice still continues. And so the idea of machismo is this honoring of male strength, right? Courage, aggressiveness. So if you think about, like, that's something that still permeates today, is this idea that a man is assertive, he takes what he wants, he has multiple women, right? This is a practice that was being developed by the Europeans and continued, right? In this era. Um, so it's been very ingrained in Latin America. And then by the mid 19th century, you begin to see more opportunities expanding for girls and for young women, um, for education. You know, but oftentimes women, there were certain professions like teaching that they were pushed towards, right? It wasn't necessarily equal to all jobs, but you begin to see more opportunities open up in the 19th century. So that's pretty much a summary of the section 3. Be able to compare the social developments in Latin America with those in North America. So I think with that, you know, this is the gist of what you would have read in chapter 31. And be ready to discuss this information in class. We're going to be doing some writing, and this information is going to help you with the writing assignments you're going to have in class. So I will see you in class.